Hello, I'm Jay Bryson, Chief Economist of the Corporate and Investment Bank at Wells Fargo, and I'm joined here today with my colleague, economist Mike Pugliese. So, Mike, it looks like President Biden recently reached a deal with a group of bipartisan senators on infrastructure. Can you tell us a little bit what's in this package?
Yeah, Jay. So the way I would think about this package is if you take the original American Jobs Plan that the Biden administration rolled out, that was about $2.25 trillion in new spending across both physical infrastructure and some other public investment areas. And the physical infrastructure in that proposal was about $1 trillion in new spending. This more recent bipartisan deal between President Biden and some senators on both sides of the aisle in Congress is about half that in new spending. So in gross spending, it's maybe a trillion, but in new spending, it's about $5 to $600 billion. And that new spending is really heavily concentrated in quote unquote kind of core or physical infrastructure. So think roads, bridges, public transit, water, broadband, those kinds of areas. And so again, that's about $5 or $600 billion in new spending, and it's paid for with a variety of kind of mixed bag policy changes. So some increased funding for the IRS to improve tax enforcement and collecting unpaid taxes, some leftover COVID relief money, some public-private partnerships. But I think more critically, what it does not include are some of the key proposed tax increases from the American Jobs Plan, like a 28% corporate rate and some of the other increases more broadly in corporate income taxes. So call it 5 or 600 billion in new spending, mostly on physical infrastructure projects, and paid for with some miscellaneous pay fors and not necessarily, kind of key benchmark tax increases.
Okay, so you just said that it was, a bipartisan group of senators who reached this. So we got, it seems like support on both sides of the aisle. Does that mean passage is just a no-brainer? It's a layup. It's going to happen?
Yeah, you would think, Jay, and I think that's what some of the individuals who were a part of the negotiations were hoping for, that we would take this bipartisan infrastructure package, if a deal could be reached, that would then be passed, and then that would leave Democrats to sort of move on their own through the budget reconciliation process to pass other parts of their agenda, the remainder of the American Jobs Plan, and then parts or maybe even all of the 1.8 trillion American Families Plan. And there were a lot of reasons to think that a bipartisan win here would be a good thing for the White House. And I certainly think they see some benefits of it. When you think about the idea of just getting this through the regular order legislative process as opposed to reconciliation, there are some procedural benefits there. I think there are probably some political advantages of doing a bipartisan deal for the White House. But there's also some challenges, and the big concern is Democrats have razor-thin majorities in the House and the Senate. It's 50-50 in the Senate with the tie broken by the vice president, and in the House, it's just a few seats for the Democrats. And so there's a real concern, not just in the White House, but in some parts of the Democratic Party, that if a bipartisan scaled back infrastructure deal like this is passed, that a lot of the other priorities on corporate income taxes, individual income taxes, on federal paid family leave, on child care subsidies, elderly care subsidies, and all of the other areas of the American Jobs and Family Plans, that those may not come to fruition in a reconciliation bill later on as kind of a phase two. And so you saw an effort among some key Democratic leaders to tie these two things together and say one can't pass without the other. Of course, that sort of just leaves us back to where we started, which is, are these all going to be tied into one package? And what is the appetite, given those razor-thin majorities, for a multi-trillion-dollar bill on both taxes and spending versus a much more scaled-down infrastructure proposal? So I don't necessarily think that this is a slam dunk to become law in the next few weeks. And I think a much bigger question remains of what are the prospects for a partisan reconciliation bill given those razor-thin majorities? However, what I do think is meaningful progress is, at least in my view, we now have a fallback option if that bigger reconciliation bill doesn't work out. If the Democrats just kind of have too much intra-party squabbling and they're not able to come to an agreement on that reconciliation package, I would think there would certainly be some grounds here later on to potentially come back to this infrastructure package that's scaled down by 5 or 600 billion and use that as a fallback plan.
Okay, so end of the day, I mean, what do you handicap the odds that, say, a year from now, we're actually doing some more infrastructure spending?
Yeah, I think if you keep it fairly narrow to just more infrastructure spending, I would certainly take over 50% on that. I think it's fairly likely that something does eventually get done. You can see that this is at least somewhat popular, right? There's been a bipartisan agreement with some key Republican senators in the White House. You've seen support from both parties for this in the past. And there's a deadline kind of prompting some action here. So there was an agreement back in 2015, a little more narrowly on infrastructure, specifically transportation infrastructure, that's expiring at the end of this September. That's why some of this total spending is really just baked in, and maybe it's $1 trillion in total, but only half of that in new spending, because there's an expectation that this expiring spending will be extended. And so there's a deadline, there's a vehicle, there's enough, I think, action here that I would personally be surprised if nothing got done by the end of this year. And whether that's in later this summer or in the fall, I think the odds are pretty good that we'll get something, even if it's a much more scaled down package like the one that was just agreed to late last week. What I think is much more unclear is there a broader deal to be had here, bipartisan or not, in terms of passing this alongside a reconciliation package that has maybe higher corporate income taxes, higher individual income taxes, and then also focuses on some of these areas that I mentioned earlier. Increased subsidies for the Affordable Care Act and more education money, extending the child tax credit expansion, climate change stuff. The list really kind of goes on and on here. But to me, that's where I think it's a lot more fuzzy, and it's something we'll hopefully get some more clarity on in the next few months. But I think we probably will get at least some additional infrastructure spending as we look to 2022 and beyond. Okay, Jay, so then let's pull this all together then. Let's say that's right. Let's say we do in the end, later this year, get a $500-600 billion or so infrastructure package spread over 5 to 8 years, something that is in the ballpark of this, right? If this is the fallback option and this is what ends up getting passed, what would something like that do to our economic forecast for growth, inflation, the Fed? How would you think about the potential impact from that?
Right. So let's use some of the numbers that you just quoted there. 500-600 billion dollars or so spread out over 5 to 8 years. It's roughly, let's call it 100 billion or so per year. That's a big number, right? But keep in mind, this is a $22 trillion economy. And so when you do the math, maybe what it does next year, maybe we would lift our GDP forecast by, I don't know, 0.25% percentage point or so, maybe a 0.5 percentage point at the outside. But if without this, we think the economy is going to grow close to, say, 6% next year, it's not really that big of a deal. Now, I think it becomes a bigger deal further out. It's going to be hard to get a lot of infrastructure spending just ramped up right away. That usually takes a while. And so the bigger impacts here probably would be maybe in 2023, 2024, where growth is not going to be still bouncing back from the pandemic. But it's not a huge game changer in terms of what we think it would mean for GDP growth. In terms of inflation, maybe we bump up our inflation forecast a little bit, but not significantly so. And this is different from the stimulus checks that we got earlier this year. Stimulus checks go out, they go right into people's pockets, they're spent right away, and that has an immediate impact. The impact here is much more spread out over time, and therefore in any given year, we don't think it would have a huge effect on the economy. So this is still very much an evolving story here. It depends on politics, but as the politics start to gel a little bit later on this year, we have a better sense of what all this means for the economy. We'll certainly keep you all posted. So again, we'd like to thank you for joining us today and look forward for more of these videos as we learn more about this infrastructure.